Our season is next week, so please come back. We'll have Dr. Jeff Scholes and Dr. George Bayuga from UCCS, and I need to brush up on my Greek here. They're going to be, the title of their talk is Christos and Oikos, Unwrapping the Real Meaning of Christmas. You won't want to miss that. But let's welcome Sky Foerster.
Thank you. Yeah, a few weeks back, Rob called and this was well planned out, well in advance, right? Because Rob called and said, well, a speaker got canceled, and you know the difference between a pinch hitter and a substitute, right? No. A substitute is somebody who follows somebody, comes in off the field, off the bench, because somebody got hurt on the field. A pinch hitter is someone who comes to play because he's better than the one that he replaced. I'm the substitute. Quick advertisement after this, despite, in addition to the soup and the cookies and everything else, you can order Afghan food from Janet and Molly and whoever else is in the foyer for pickup next week. Nan and Bilani, I think, is on fare. So I wanted to make sure you knew about that. And yeah, Leanne set this up, and Josh both set this up very nicely. I was going to make some comment that, it's kind of ironic that we're going to talk about war and conflict on Peace Sunday during Advent. And I was debating whether this reflects the triumph of hope over experience or the triumph of experience over hope. Suffice to say that it is a battle between hope and experience. But what I want to do is take, we've talked about the war in Ukraine a lot, kind of updates, and I'll briefly talk about that. There's a lot of concern, for good reason, about the war in Gaza, and as Catherine's letter to Leanne pointed out, there's Gaza and Hamas, and then there's the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority, and never the twain shall meet. So this is a tough conflict. But I also want to talk about a couple of other things that dominate our news, because to listen to people talk about China and Iran, you would say that those two countries were also Satan personified, and we don't know what to do about them. So I thought I would talk about all that stuff from kind of 30,000 feet, and we can get into details in Q&A. And this picture of the world at war in 2023, it looks pretty ugly except for the Western Hemisphere. I want to talk a little bit about what are the sources of conflict and principles of statecraft. And I'm drawing from an article that a British colleague of mine and I wrote last spring. The site is on there, Principles for Statecraft in a Dangerous World. And spoiler alert, there's no simple answer at the end. But these are the questions I want to kind of take a look at. What are the sources of conflict? Are there principles of conflict that can help us deal with it? And can we apply those to contemporary conflicts? And the biggies are these. By the way, the picture on the top right is the picture of I forgot whether it's Avdiivka or Mariupol, but they both look the same in eastern Ukraine and Donetsk. And the picture on the lower right is Gaza. There's two basic sources of conflict in the world, and the problem is that each feeds off the other. One of them is I lump in a big category called systemic threats to social order. Stuff like climate change, financial crises, economic dislocation, disruptive technologies, whether it's disinformation or artificial intelligence or cyber or whatever, and infectious diseases. And all of those things put together, none of them involve bullets, but all of those things, they transcend national boundaries. They make conflict more, not less likely in our world, and that's really the punchline. The communities that are most affected are also the most vulnerable in the community. They lead to radicalization of groups and ideology that reinforces interests, and I like to when I point this out to a lot of audiences, I also say that you can build all the walls you want, but migration pressures in the 21st century are going to increase, not decrease. Then there's another source that has become resurgent in the last decade or so, since the end of the Cold War, and since, I would say, the coming of age of post-Soviet Russia and a modernized China. And that is great power competition, something that many of us in this room thought went away when the Cold War ended. And it's global and regional, whether it's Iran or China in its own region, or whether it's in Eurasia. Many of the conflicts that, frankly, it's fascinating to me to read the history of the Paris peace talks in 1919 and see what the agenda was, and then think about where are all the conflicts today. So it's old world conflicts renewed. Maybe one of the side benefits of the Cold War was that all those things were repressed during the Soviet and Western competition. There are clearly competing visions of world order. Remember Bush 41, George H.W. Bush talked about a new world order, a world order that, we built the world order after World War II, right? And then after the Cold War, we were the dominant player in building what George H.W. Bush called a new world order. And fundamentally what we have, particularly whether you're looking at Russia or China or Iran, is we have different visions of what that world order ought to look like. And for the most part, their visions of world order don't include us. We have the weaponization of technology, and not just technology making weapons that shoot things, like bullets and so on, but the weaponization of technology, whether it's information or anything else, in our politics that threaten our institutions. The very things on which we depend can be destroyed without a bullet being fired. And then we have inadequate institutions, and I include in that in the United Nations. Most of the international institutions that we created after World War II are proving, when it comes to these conflicts, not that they're impotent institutions and they have no relevance, but when it comes to these conflicts, basically don't have much impact or relevance, except the moral authority of whatever the Secretary General of the UN says, and frankly, to the combatants, that doesn't mean much. But all of these things are interdependent. They make the issues even more intractable. Everybody, when they talk about it, particularly our own politicians, we talk about it in zero-sum games. They win, we win. Whose side are you on? I'm on this team. I stand with Israel. I stand with Palestine. I'm sorry, who is Palestine? And for that matter, who is Israel? Are we talking about Jews? So we have this spike of anti-Semitism? Or is it Islamophobia? Or, oh, we had Christians in Bethlehem. Who knew? Right? Well, some did. Some of us did. But, most people just say, well, that's all Muslim. And I don't like Muslims. And Hamas equates to Palestine, and Palestine equates to Islam, so we just don't like Islam. And you see this all the time. And yes, my last line, and civilian societies are targets, and that's an increasingly difficult part of war, because I can't think of any contemporary conflict in which civilians aren't a deliberate target of war, notwithstanding a century and a half of international laws of war. And then, yes, that is a pun at the end. Power trumps laws. Each exacerbates the other, and unfortunately, conflict, maybe not violence, but conflict is inevitable. And I think we need to bear that in mind, particularly when I talk about China and Iran. So, let's talk about some principles, assumptions, if you will, about how we should think about these matters. States and people operate out of self-interest. Mr. Putin went into Ukraine out of self-interest. Now, he had his frame of rationality. It was a little cockeyed. It wasn't very smart. But nobody ever went to war knowing they were going to lose. Everybody goes to war thinking they're going to win, and preferably quickly. Right? So it isn't that we should have a debate about whether states or people are self-interested. It's a question, I'm self-interested, you're self-interested, but it's a question of how we define our interests. Are our interests exclusive to everybody else, or are they inclusive of everyone? Rationality is in the eye of the beholder, right? Israel thinks it's rational. Hamas on October 7th was acting rationally within Hamas's frame of reference. It's not your rationality, and it's not mine, and it certainly wasn't the Israeli government's rationality, and it certainly didn't seem rational to the people in the kibbutzes who were kidnapped and killed. When Xi Jinping thinks about the rest of the world, he's thinking about China's self-interest. Oh, and his own political self-interest. Iran has its own view of the world, and we're going to come back to this, because if we don't understand how others see the world, we're not going to have much luck trying to understand what's going on. The second principle is that state power is inherently limited. Power in this world in which we live is contextual. You say, well, how much power do you have? Well, it depends on what context, right? The United States or Russia, we have lots of nuclear weapons. Doesn't do us much good in the trade talks, right? We can deter conflict in many parts of the world, but compelling somebody to do something that they don't want to do is not something we generally have a lot of success with. So how much power one has, correlation of forces in the old discussion about the Soviet Union, is all a relative term. By the way, if you're interested in this subject, there's a wonderful book by Moises Naim, who's actually Venezuelan, that basically, the title is something, he's got a couple of books on this line, but basically, Power Ain't What It Used to Be. It's a wonderful book. Power is hard to get, easy to lose. This is punchline. The other principle that's within this is that the means and ends of policy must be in alignment. Now that sounds like an academic phrase, right? We have a whole history of believing in this country that when we use military power to solve a problem, that when the military is victorious, we've solved the problem. Raise your hand if you think that's worked any time in the last 20 years. And yet the military was always successful. I spent 30 years in uniform. I'm proud of what the military can and can do, but also what it understands it can't do. But sometimes we forget the second part, and most of all, politicians forget the second part, so that we go win the war, but we lose the peace. Iraq and to some extent Afghanistan are classic examples of that. And most of us in this room are old enough to remember another war in Southeast Asia which demonstrated that principle. A couple of quotes I love to use when trying to describe this situation. George Kennan, you remember, head of the foreign policy planning staff in the State Department after the Cold War, or after the World War II, authored a number of, he offered the long telegram from Moscow, which basically explained why Stalin didn't want to play in the Marshall Plan, and called The Sources of Soviet Conduct. And it became a classic foreign affairs article in 1947, and Kennan went on to say this in the National War College in 1948. And remember, as you read this, and I'll read it aloud, when you read this, remember that in the wake of World War II, as in the wake of World War I, we were the only country left standing. Forget who won or lost. Everybody else was on their face. We, the United States, with barely 3% of the world's population, accounted for over 55% of global GDP, just us. Everybody else was busted, broke, whether they were destroyed, whether they were defeated or not. And if we weren't, as he say, strong enough then, when would we ever be strong enough? We are great and strong, but we are not great enough or strong enough to conquer or to change or to hold in subjugation by ourselves all hostile or irresponsible forces, all those bad guys out there. And remember, this is at a time, a few years earlier, George Patton was saying, let's go all the way to Warsaw and to Moscow. To attempt to do so would mean to call upon our own people for sacrifices which would in themselves completely alter our way of life and our political institutions and would lose the real objectives of our policy in trying to defend them. Curiously, a half century later, a gentleman who just recently died, a very controversial figure, in a book called Does America Need a Foreign Policy in 2000, some Americans, I'll show you who in a minute, exulting in their country's power, urged the explicit affirmation of a benevolent American hegemony. That such an aspiration would impose on the U.S. a burden no society has ever managed successfully for an indefinite period of time, would gradually unite the world against the United States and force it into positions that would eventually leave it isolated and drained. A year before 9/11, a year before the war in Afghanistan, 2 years before the war in Iraq. So, to whom was Henry talking? Liberals? No. Neoconservatives. Bill Bennett, Reagan's Secretary of Education, one of the intellectual architects of the neoconservative movement that dominated the George W. Bush administration. Today, America sits at the summit. Our military strength is the envy of every nation on earth. It would be tragic indeed if we did not use this extraordinary historical moment to promote the ideals at the heart of our national enterprise. In other words, use force to rebuild the world in our own image. And that was to whom Henry was talking about. The moral of this story: military force must be aligned with political objectives. It is a means to an end, not an end in itself. When the fighting stops, are you any closer to accomplishing what you set out to do? A question for us in Vietnam, a question for us in Iraq, a question I would hazard for Mr. Putin in Ukraine, and a question clearly for Mr. Netanyahu in Israel. So, the third principle. Empathy is the most important strategic virtue. Hubris is the most dangerous of strategic vices. We cannot use ideology as a litmus test to whom we are going to talk. This was relevant when we get to Iran. We haven't had diplomatic relations since 1979. Is there any question wondering why we don't understand what's going on inside of Tehran? We look at it through the outside or through the eyes of others on whom we depend to do our diplomatic interactions, such as it is. This tends to demonization because we don't understand the other. We are not empathic about the other. We think we know better. And this sounds familiar in a lot of cases. This also is true about personal relationships, but I'm not here to talk about personal relationships. But it's either or thinking, and there's no exit from this spiral. And all you have to do is listen to the debate on the Hill about should we give aid to Iran, to Ukraine? Should we give aid to Israel? Should we give aid to should we do something about the Palestinians? What should we be doing? And the answer is actually we're doing all of it. But politicians aren't very happy about that because they want us to do one of those, right? Proving once again that a mortal sage, I don't know who said it first, in politics as in life, those who stand in the middle of the road are twice as likely to get run over. We cannot assume or insist that others share our worldview. That's not to say values don't matter. Our values certainly matter, and they're not mutually exclusive with our interests. I mean, political science classes like to talk about values versus interests, and I know I do that, but at the end of the day, they're interrelated with each other. Our values underpin our interests. And frankly, in a world in which power is contextual, as I mentioned before, our moral power is the most important source of our power in the world. And I think recent years have demonstrated that both for good and for ill. But other actors have security interests that are legitimate as well. And that is not our worldview. And we can decide that, well, your security interests aren't legitimate. But we're not going to have very much success in convincing Iran, for example, that it doesn't need nuclear weapons, or doesn't need, actually, Iran hasn't concluded it needs nuclear weapons. What Iran has concluded is that it needs the capacity to become a nuclear weapon state.
like Germany, like Japan, like Sweden, and a lot of others. But we don't trust Iran, and we trust the Germans, and we trust others. But it doesn't mean they don't have a legitimate security interest. Russia has legitimate security interests. Oh no, by the way, dominating Ukraine is not one of those. But they do have legitimate security interests, and so if we don't take those into account, we're not going to have much luck managing the conflicts that ensue. And finally, collaborative partnership is a key to forging collective action. No, the United States is not in charge. This is not a hierarchy. This is not 1947, 1948. We can, as Barack Obama used to say, set the agenda. And others do depend on us. But we cannot dictate the outcomes. All right, so enough for the principles. Let's talk about how they might apply. And this, we talked about this before. The invasion failed. Ukraine had a great counteroffensive, and that red area in the eastern part of that map of Ukraine has been about the battle lines since about October 2022. So 13, 14 months. Hasn't moved a lot. Oh, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands have died over places like Bakhmut and Avdiivka, which is kind of where, they're kind of around where that dot is. Counteroffensives and offensives is trench warfare. It's World War I. It's not the 21st century. Over 500,000 casualties, many more Russian, 1.5 to 2 to 1. But Russia has a bigger population, so it's tough on both sides. And everybody understands this is ugly and it's not going anywhere. There is no, and we expected too much to think that Ukraine was going to be able to push through and have a decisive counteroffensive. And that's a whole nother conversation, but I think a lot of the advice Ukrainian military was getting from people in the United States and in other NATO countries was, more than could be generated, particularly since they didn't have any air superiority. But US and NATO have been trying to balance this. How do we support Ukraine without triggering an escalatory war with Russia? And Putin knows that. And he is holding out at great cost, but not to him politically, really. He's holding out ultimately for what he hopes to be a 2024 US election that brings to the White House somebody that will basically say, take it. We're leaving out of NATO. And there are a lot of Europeans right now who are very worried about the prospect of what might happen in 2024. This is not a political podium, but I am pointing out a reality. But there is no exit ramp, and I think we talked about this a couple of months ago. We can't have a Munich. Can't say, just take it, like the British did and the Allies did in 1938. Just take the Sudetenland and the rest of Czechoslovakia. You won't want anything else, right, Adolf? No Yalta. We're not going to go off in a back room and decide Ukraine's fate without Ukraine in the room. And no stab in the back, which is what happened at the end of World War I when the German military decided that everybody, including their own leadership, stabbed them in the back so that they just had to rebuild and go back and get revenge. In other words, if you don't really get to the point of the conflict and find an answer that makes peace durable, a ceasefire simply just stops the shooting for now, but it doesn't resolve the conflict. And it may not be any outcome that anyone can tolerate for very long, and it may just be a pause between the next round of violence. We'll come back to that. A different kind of war. The numbers are staggering. 1,200 dead, 6,900 wounded in the initial attack, 240 hostages. About 100 or so have been released since then. And a lot of Palestinians in Israeli jails who've been on administrative detention, which is to say no charges, no trials, no nothing for over a year. basically because you're a 15-year-old man or boy and you live in Gaza, you must be Hamas. The objective for Hamas was put the issue of Palestine back on the table because they were very sore afraid that Israel and the Saudis were going to have a rapprochement and the Arab world was going to forget Hamas. Well, forget the Palestinian Authority. They're in the West Bank, and we don't like them either, says Hamas. So that's their own problem. And that's been the underlying problem here in this part of the world for an awfully long time. On both the Israeli and the Palestinian side, anytime anybody got even remotely close to thinking about a two-state solution and making it happen, Hamas and or Israeli settlers would start throwing rocks, bombs, and whatever to create violence, to evoke violence, and make everybody skedaddle back into their trenches and forget about a peace plan. So it's extremism on both sides, but it is extremism nonetheless. Not to be conflated with all Palestinians, not to be conflated with all Jews or even the citizens of Israel. Of course, the Israeli retaliation is staggering in its numbers. You see them there. The major cities are reduced to rubble. They told everybody in the north to go south so that they could turn the north into rubble in Gaza City. And now they're moving on Khan Yunis in the south and telling all the Gazans to get out of the way. Where were they supposed to go, right? Egypt is not letting them go into the Sinai and to escape that. They have no place to go back north. And this was always going to be the worst part of the war because actually the Hamas strongholds are in the south, not in the north. And yes, Hamas has integrated itself into civilian infrastructure. There's no denying that. So yes, we can argue that Israel's retaliation is, by any measure of imagination, totally out of proportion, totally inconsonant with the laws of warfare. But laws of warfare that were, I'm not justifying it, but laws of warfare that were made in a different time. But when Hamas builds its tunnels and has its strongholds and its ammunition supplies co-located with schools and hospitals, and you got to root them out, if you're going to do anything at all, then there's going to be a lot of civilian casualties. I'm not justifying it, I'm simply applying. Been watching this wonderful film series on the Pacific, the same producers who did Band of Brothers. And it's brutal about the war in the Pacific. But as I watch it and I think about, the Marines trying to root out Japanese who were, hiding in every cave, ready to blow themselves up in whatever number of Marines they could, and how hard that was to root them out in the Pacific, one thing I noted that's different from Gaza is there were no civilians on those islands. And then you project it onto this, and how do you, as a practical matter, do what Israel says it wants to do, which is to eradicate Hamas, which I don't think they can do. Because even the most spectacular military victory, back to my earlier point, is not going to eradicate Hamas, the idea of Hamas. The desire for revenge is not going away. The radicalization of everybody touched in Palestine, including in the West Bank, because settlers are starting to expand the conflict or take license by violence in the West Bank, in the settlements, and then, of course, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon firing rockets into the West Bank as well. This could explode into something bigger. We hope not. But there is no end game here any more than there's an end game in Ukraine, except saying, well, we need a two-state solution, but none of the players want that any more than there is anything to negotiate, as Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said in September. Well, there's nothing to negotiate about. We just, at the worst, we can stop the war and just claim the territory we have. That would be nice, right? So in both Ukraine and in here, what are the implications of a ceasefire? Do you simply give the combatants an opportunity to regroup? Do you simply, in the case of Ukraine, Russia says, well, I got my territory. In the case here, Israel says, well, at least I laid the place to waste, but I haven't accomplished anything. What is the end game? And are we simply fueling the next road of violence? Now let's take a look at a couple of other conflicts that aren't violent, but they're certainly dangerous conflicts, right? I love this map that I have on the top right, because if you're China looking out at the world, it looks like you're encircled. And I've attended forums and panels in which Chinese scholars will show a map like this and say, see, we're surrounded by the West, because we got Japan and the Philippines and Indonesia and Singapore, and they control all of that. And we're stuck in here. So we have to get out of this encirclement. The goal ultimately is the reunification with Taiwan, but I'm not losing sleep over, for reasons we can talk about later, I'm not losing sleep over the prospect of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. They want to assert themselves as a global power. I'm not sure China really wants to take the responsibilities that go along with it, but they are certainly using economic leverage throughout, particularly the developing world. I don't worry about an alliance with Russia, because China is the very senior partner in that relationship, and they're just going to exploit Russia for whatever they can get. They like what Russia can sell to them: oil, gas, and a lot of other things. Raise your hand if you think they're playing market rates. But Russia is desperate for, consumer goods that it can't get from anywhere else because of sanctions. They're desperate for ammunition. Thank you, North Korea. But Russia's in a dependent place here. This is not an alliance of equals, and China has not been full-throated in their support. In fact, they've been actually very helpful in some respects, reminding Putin that nuclear weapons are not on the table and that any solution must uphold the principles of the United Nations. I would agree to both those propositions. The thing that makes China different in our relationship than our relationship with the Soviet Union is, although many politicians in Washington who didn't live through the Cold War want to equate the two, is that we have an interdependent relationship with China, but we had no interdependency with the Soviet Union, right? I mean, there was the first world, that was the West. There was the second world, that was the communist economic structure, and then everybody else in the world was the third world. That's where those phrases came from. But we are interdependent with them. We are each other's largest export market, or one of the largest export markets. And China, and Xi Jinping knows this, is in long-term decline. Its population is going to go down. Its economic capacity is going down. It is, much of the developing world is indebted to it, but it's like that old adage, if you owe the bank $100, the bank owns you. But if you owe the bank $1 million, you own the bank. And most of those countries, particularly in Africa, are saying, no, I don't think I'll pay you, because I can't. And China's left to having to forgive loans. And, oh yeah, well, okay, I built that port, so I guess the port is now mine. Big deal. Long-term China prospects for China are not good, and Xi Jinping knows that. And I point out really as an application of this principle that despite all of this anti-Chinese feeling in circles in the Hill and elsewhere, that Biden and Xi met in San Francisco about a month ago. No earth-shattering results, but some very important things came out of that. We've been trying to get military-to-military dialogue with the Chinese for a long time. And Xi Jinping allowed us out, yeah, that can start happening. We affirmed that we were not going to decouple ourselves from the Chinese economy. Not that we could, but it's nice to admit the reality, right? And we started to have a dialogue, who knows what it'll look like, about the role of artificial intelligence. a tool that is very powerful, but if you're a government, is also very dangerous. And then finally, let me take a look at Iran, and then we'll make some conclusions. As I said before, we've had no formal diplomatic relations with Iran since 1979, a principle that I don't think has helped us one bit, because we've now taken to the point of, it's like with North Korea, well, if we didn't have diplomatic relations, and if we started to have diplomatic relations, then what did they do to deserve it, right? Maybe it's in our interests. But we don't do that. I mean, we never broke diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. In fact, it's a good thing, because all throughout the Cold War, the reason that we all survived it was because we and the Soviets, like voting in Chicago, talked early and often. We talked all the time. Even in the most frigid moments of the Cold War, we and the Soviets talked, because we both knew what would happen if we didn't talk. This is a theocracy, and it is more hardline now than it was before the 2021 elections, and probably even more hardline during the days of Ahmadinejad. We have three issues with them. One, obviously, the Iranian nuclear deal, which isn't, right? We tend to think that we were the only parties to that. We actually weren't, so I thought I'd list them there. We pulled out. Biden tried to resuscitate, but he was doing that on the eve of the radicalized election of June of 2021. And there really was never any prospect of kind of pretending we're going to go back to 2018 when Trump pulled out, or in 2018 when Trump pulled out. But boy, what did we accomplish there? Iran today is weeks away from having a nuclear weapons capability. They haven't, I don't believe, and I don't know of anybody who believes that can point to any evidence that they have made a decision to be a nuclear weapon state. But they certainly want to have the capacity to do so. And had we stayed in that deal, they would not be where they are today. They would have been a lot further away. But that was the deal. That was what Trump did. The other problem that few people realize is that Iran's support for terrorist groups all throughout their friends, amongst their friends in the Middle East, which I've listed there, that is the tool by which they challenge U.S. interests in the region. 61 attacks as of yesterday on U.S. bases and facilities in Iraq and in Syria since October 17th, 10 days after the war in Gaza started. That's a lot of attacks in less than 2 months. Now, I can count American casualties on one hand with many fingers left over. But it is attacks on facilities. And at some point, you have to respond. And so now Mr. Biden has yet another balancing act here, right? There are some people calling for us to bomb Iran, because they wanted to bomb Iran ever since 9/11, or before, or since 1979. But that's not going to happen. And we don't want to start a major war in the Middle East with Syria or with the Iraqi government that we helped create, but is pro-Iranian. We don't want to start a war with them over this. So we retaliate back. Oh, you slap me, I slap you. And so we hit a terrorist camp or whatever, but we're swatting flies, but that's okay, because that's what we're doing. We're demonstrating a point, but we don't want to escalate the war. Is it the right balance? I don't know, you tell me. But what I'm trying to convey here is that all of these things require very deliberate balance. And then the third issue, which is also brutal when you look at it in its own way, is the theocracy's war against women, particularly. And the way the women in Iran are fighting back, which is really spectacular, because many have gotten to the point where they just aren't going to take it anymore. But you could almost see this coming. About 10 years ago, I saw a fascinating statistic that 2/3 of the places in Iranian institutions of higher education, 2/3 of those places were taken up by women. Now let me see, if you start educating the women of a country that typically you haven't done anything with the women, and now most of your college graduates are women, do you think your country might change? I don't know, to the theocrats, what were you thinking? But how do we, again, a balance. Do we charge and do we make that our fight too? Do the women in Tehran who are burning their headscarves, do they want to be associated with the great Satan and have them be conflated with us? No. So and besides, we don't have a great track record with regime change anyway. So, where do I end up with all this? It's hard. And it's agonizing for all the reasons that Leanne and Josh reminded us today, because we feel that pain. We have a letter from Bethlehem. We have refugees from parts of the world here in Colorado Springs who are trying to make their own lives better, survivable, sustainable, starting over in almost every case. And a lot of people in this country who, again, because we've been here before, want to just retreat from all these conflicts, right? America First was not original to Donald Trump. America First was a movement in the late 1930s, largely anti-Semitic, very isolationist, with very loud, influential voices. Rachel Maddow's recent book, Prequel, does a great job of reminding us of that history. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt confided to his own advisors in 1940 that if Congress knew what I was really doing to help the British survive, I'd be impeached. So this is not the first time we've been here. This has always been an itch within the American political psyche. But we cannot retreat from these conflicts. Whatever we do will shape the outcomes. If we're there, we shape the outcome. If we leave, we shape the outcome. So there's no such thing as no impact. And my rule about power vacuums is the same as in physics. Beware of power vacuums, because if you don't fill it, somebody else will. And you may not like the way they fill it. Simplistic either-or solutions don't work. We want them to win. We want them to win. Well, maybe neither one of them is going to win. It's not zero-sum. Many of us of the generation of unconditional surrenders in 1945 think that's the way it ought to be. We haven't had one since, and we're probably never going to have one. Military force has to be aligned with political objectives and the rule of law, not only for moral reasons and legal reasons, but otherwise you simply sow the seeds of the next round of violence. And you don't succeed. And we have lots of examples today about how that works. If peace is to be more than a pause in the violence, then the players must have a stake in maintaining it. Now that seems kind of innocuous, right? I get criticized when I say it. What? I mean, Russia has to have a stake in the settlement of Ukraine? Yeah. If we're going to find some way of reconciling issues with respect to Taiwan and China, then China's got to have a stake in that security outcome. Why? Because otherwise there won't be any reconciliation, because we can't dictate the outcome, folks. So it is one thing to say, and I've said it, no Munichs in Ukraine. But whatever we do in Ukraine has got, at the end of the day, to create some sense of security, at least for a post-Putin Russia. I'm not sure you can deal with Putin. In fact, I'm pretty sure you can't. But there will be a post-Putin Russia. And if we demonize all Russians, we miss opportunities. Last time I looked, we actually dealt reasonably well for a while with Mr. Khrushchev. We dealt reasonably well with Mr. Brezhnev. We had détente. And we dealt very well with a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. So let's not conclude that all Russians are despotic autocrats intent on remaking the world. International security should not be a pawn of domestic politics, and that's where this comes home to me here. Because I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, we don't do ourselves any good service when our politicians, including some local ones, I wouldn't want to mention any names, say, well, I'm here, and everybody else is over there, and I don't support them. And we should do nothing to help them. It's not that simple. And we will rue the day if we let that kind of simplistic politics driven by personal political agendas instead of a real understanding of the complexity of our world. If we let that kind of politics dominate our selection of candidates, our selection of office holders, particularly over the course of the next year. So with that, I'll stop. It's noon, so I guess we got about 15 minutes for Q&A and whatever else you want to do, or go by Nan and Bilani from Janet and Molly. There's a microphone coming to whoever.
Can you shed some light on just what it is that Iran is working toward in the Middle East? Do they want to secure their own authority? Do they want to be the big boss? What's going on?
Fascinating question. Iran, and we'll start with the obvious, Iran is Shia, and the Middle East is dominated by Sunni, Saudis, Gulf states, and so on. So there's a rivalry for political influence that takes a form of Sunni Shia, although it's, you know, it's like Protestants and Catholics in the 17th century, right? It isn't really about theology, right? It's about power struggle, but it gets conflated with the two. Iran's not trying to take over the Middle East. They're trying to expand their influence in what they view as a hostile world, a hostile Islamic world, because their principal rival in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia. And this is a real danger. And I think it's probably one of the reasons that Iran has not taken the step to be a nuclear weapon state, because Saudi Arabia could become a nuclear weapon state fairly quickly too, right? I mean, that's the problem with this. So then you have a nuclear standoff potentially, and that's not pretty. And that's also why Israel keeps its nuclear weapons. Oh no, we don't talk about it. Iran is trying to assert its influence and what it sees, rightly or legitimately or wrongly, a prevailing Western influence in the Arab world, which is pro-Arab and anti-Iran. So they are using their proxies in the region to undercut our interests in the region. They don't want a peace process in Israel, not because Iranians hate Jews, that's not the, in fact, Iran and Israel actually had an alliance for many years, had an alliance of the pariahs, when both were pariah states in their own way. But it is about American influence and it is about Arab influence. So for them it is about countering, having strong influence in a world that they think legitimately they should be a dominant player. I mean, they're the largest country in the region. I also think, by the way, in large part because of what I was talking about, the education of women, that in the long run, if you can get rid of the theocracy in Iran, the country in the Middle East most likely to become a sustainable democracy, in my book, the answer to that is Iran. Not any of the sheikdoms of the Middle East, which is essentially an ancient form of governance. So it's not Iran's trying to take over the Middle East. Iran is trying to establish its influence in the Middle East and to fight off what it sees as rival forces that are out to get it. And, you know, the thing about paranoia is that it may be true. It may not be totally true, but it may be partly true. Good question, thank you.
Any other questions?
There's in the back. Judith.
I have two domestic questions. I do a lot with food and agriculture, and 2 or 3 years ago, a major general came to talk to us about his concern about the troops that were recruiting into the United States. They were mainly overweight, which made them susceptible to diabetes, and very often their education attainment was not what they were really looking for. So he was appealing to the agricultural community to help strengthen our troops, which is a little concerning. And then I'm really concerned about what's happening on academic campuses. So can you address
On
those
academic campuses.
those two issues that are within
Two
our own
very
country?
non-related questions, but they're perfectly good ones. I can't talk about the state of recruitment at the moment, but yeah, there is a problem of overweightness, although boot camps do a pretty good job of, fixing that. I will confess that when I arrived at the Air Force Academy in 1967, I was overweight, but I lost 50 pounds in about 6 weeks, so it worked. Now, I found it. The educational attainment is the bigger issue. Because we have a very technologically sophisticated military, and we need men and women who can manage the weaponry and the technology. I mean, this is not, get a strapping young 18-year-old male, give him a carbine, and send him off to war. This is not that kind of war. So that's the bigger issue. It's about education and not only technological education, but I would include in that civics education, reminding people that there's a thing called civilian. There's a thing called civilian control of the military, and an apolitical military. And given, and I'll just say, given the proclivity of many political candidates to position themselves in front of a bunch of uniformed soldiers, to me is a violation of everything I thought I understood about wearing the uniform, but I'll leave it at that. And the second question, universities. I think it's pretty simple. Universities are places for critical thinking and the free exchange of ideas. However, there are limits. So yeah, I think, the chancellor, the president of the University of Pennsylvania resigned yesterday, and I think it was probably well-reasoned. I mean, she got a lot of pushback from her own board and so on. I don't think there should be much equivocation. It shouldn't be too hard to say to a student body, free exchange of ideas is fine, but calling for genocide of anybody is not. I don't know why that's hard. But again, it's this, we're either here or we're here in our politics. It's not freedom of speech all the time. It never was. And so I think universities have lost, many universities, I'm probably only talking about a few, but many universities have apparently lost their compass on that. Total believer of critical thinking and free speech in universities, including amongst faculty. But faculty should also know better too. So, I think there was another question.
From half the world away, a two-state solution is pretty appealing, seems obvious. Can you give the strong arguments, at least that some groups and stakeholders have, against a two-state solution?
Well, the first answer is it all depends on what you mean by a two-state solution, right? The Israeli two-state solution means you have a state, I have a state, I get to have strong military, you don't. It's kind of like Russia and Ukraine, when Russia said, oh, well, we don't need, we want Ukraine to be neutral. We don't want you to be in NATO, but we want you to be neutral and disarmed, right? And I don't know of a successful neutral state that was ever disarmed, right? Look at all the neutrals in the world today. Their GDP per capita for defense, per capita GDP for defense spending is more than if they had, friends and allies to come to their defense. Amongst the Palestinian side, the reasons for not a two-state solution is, but I want the whole loaf, and that's Hamas. Hamas is the one who's always been against a two-state solution and has always rejected and made it difficult for the Palestinian Authority to even approach that process. Because that would mean, well, Gaza and the West Bank and however the boundaries are drawn, Hamas is now secondary. It's a revolutionary force. It defines itself as that. And they want Palestine to be the whole thing. Hence the phrase, from the river to the sea, right? So if you want the whole loaf, you don't want a two-state solution. Now, there are those on the right wing of the Likud, which is the political party that Netanyahu has been enabled by to be prime minister, notwithstanding indictments and everything else. And as I once interviewed somebody who was on the far right of the Israeli spectrum, and he said basically, well, we just want what God gave us. God gave us Judea and Samaria. That's the West Bank. And we don't even want all of what God promised us. Aren't we nice? We don't want a Palestinian state unless we can control it and make sure it isn't a threat to us, because there are those terrorists over there. So those are the arguments which you find on the extremist side of both sides. But you're right, the only real outcome here is a legitimate two-state solution. The only real outcome in Russia and Ukraine is Ukraine within its pre-2014 borders, Russian troops out, but assurances to Ukrainian security, and oh yes, to Russian security. And then you have to figure out what to do about reparations, you have to figure out about war crimes and all those other things because of what the violence has beget. Is that a word? Beget, begotten? And those will be complicating issues in that as well. I hope that, but at the moment, the reason there hasn't been a serious negotiation about a two-state solution since Yasser Arafat died is because, actually even before he died, because he was offered a two-state solution by the Israeli government, and Arafat wouldn't take yes for an answer. Shortly after that, he died. Then they realized how corrupt he was. And so when it came time for elections, nobody wanted to vote for the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. They voted for Hamas because, well, you're a bunch of corrupt. Fill in the blanks.
I know we have lots more questions here. Marcia flagged me down last. I think this might be our last question. I'm afraid it's 1:15, so.
I'm really worried about the Ukrainians bogged down in World War I, and I before Israel even erupted, that is such a horrendous situation. And if you were in Biden's cabinet, what kind of advice would you be giving him?
Well, I'm not going to be in Biden's cabinet. They won't be calling me. Actually, I think Biden is, after October 7th, the cards in his hand got worse. But they weren't very good anyway, because, I mean, you have people after the last election cycle, when you have people like J.D. Vance basically saying, we don't care about what happens in Ukraine. Come on, J.D., you know better than that. Or DeSantis saying, oh, this is simply a border issue. I mean, you got a whole lot of people who didn't bother to understand what was happening or even to think about history. You know, what I didn't really highlight, one of the slides, I mean, what do you think the world would look like if the United States decided to stop supporting Ukraine and pulled out of NATO? Raise your hand if you think that's a better world. That's a rhetorical question. I don't happen to think so. But anyway, I got off track. What to do about that? We've got to keep providing Ukraine with the wherewithal to defend itself, and that includes air cover, air power. One of the reasons, and Ukrainians are telling us this, one of the reasons they were not able to do any better in the counteroffensive was because they didn't have air superiority. And we have, basically withheld F-16s. Now we're training F-16 pilots. We're supposed to provide them, but of course, you know what the weather is like in Ukraine right now, and we're not going to be a lot of F-16 flying anyway, right? So it would be, all right, what does Ukraine need to be able to break this stalemate come spring, when the mud starts to dry up? And that includes ATACMS, which we're providing, very small numbers, tactical missiles, for long-range artillery, because we've got to be able to get to the supply lines in the back, and you got to have air superiority to do that. So, but right now we can't even get anything out of Congress, and given that we're in an election year next year, and Biden's his bag of lucky beans is very small at the moment in terms of political influence. That's going to be a long, hard slog, but he's got to keep doing it, and it's the right thing to do. And the other thing is to make sure that we don't elect people in any election, national, local, whatever, who are determined to turn their back on that. That's as political as you'll ever hear me.
Well, thank you, Sky. I'm sure he'll stick around for some of those questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to you all, but thank you again.